Hi, I'm Jarrad Brown, Australian expat financial planner based here in Singapore. Thank you for tuning into my video today. What I'd like to discuss is the very common question that we're asked by a lot of our Australian expat clients, whether they be in Singapore or elsewhere in the world, and that is, should I buy my forever home before I move back to Australia? Now, when I say forever home, I am specifically referring to Australia. We're not going to get into the areas to buy or the real estate market in Australia. We're going to focus more on some of the considerations when it comes to this thought, to this question of when is the right time to buy that forever home. So in this video, we're going to cover some of the key considerations when you might want to buy before or when you might want to buy after you move back, and some of the critical things to think about, and hopefully some tips and insights that you can apply to your own situation and work out what makes the most sense for you. So let's dive right in. So in this video, we're just going to create a relatively simple scenario just to give us some talking points around each of the considerations. So we'll assume that a client of ours, John, is an Australian citizen living and working in Singapore. He's got $200,000 sitting in the bank, and he's planning to move back to Australia within the next 2 years, he thinks. He's not 100% certain, but he's pretty sure that he'd probably like to be back in Australia at that point. And once he moves back, he's going to continue working in Australia. So that's the very simple scenario. We're not going to create too many other intricacies around that because we want to keep this relatively simple. So let's have a look at what John should be thinking about when it comes to whether or not he should buy his home before he goes back to Australia, or if he should wait until he's back on the ground. So let's get right into it. Now, the first thing John is going to want to think about is his borrowing capacity. So by this, I mean working out how much he can afford to borrow as a non-resident of Australia while he's working in Singapore, and how much he can afford to borrow under his assumed salary, tax rates, living expenses, etc., once he moves back to Australia. Now, the one thing that we're not really going to be able to know with certainty is exactly what the interest rates will be once John's back in Australia, but we can create some fairly accurate estimates to give us a good guide of how much John can actually afford to borrow. Now, given that tax rates in Singapore are significantly lower than they are in Australia, you'll often find that your ability to borrow may in fact be a lot higher while you're in Singapore than when you're back in Australia. Now, this is not a one-size-fits-all. It does differ case by case, but a very good starting point to work out whether you can only afford to borrow while you're offshore, or whether you can only afford to borrow while you're onshore back in Australia, or whether you have both options available to you. So that's the first point, your borrowing capacity whilst offshore. The second critical consideration is the interest rate that's going to apply to your loan, both as an expat and then as a resident of Australia. Now, what we've seen over the last decade is the interest rates that apply to investors and the interest rates that apply for owner-occupiers do differ, and investors often will get charged a premium. Now, you may find that if you're moving back in the short term, i.e. within the next 6 or so months, that you may be able to apply for your loan as an owner-occupier loan with the view that you will be back in Australia in the near term. But if you are going to keep it as an investment, if you're not going to rent it out, you do need to think about what those interest rates are going to look like. If you're thinking you might buy it for a year or two, rent it out, then move back into the property once you're back in Australia, then you may want to think about how you structure your loan, i.e. whether you fix the rate or keep it variable, with the view that you can then refinance that loan to an owner-occupier rate, i.e. hopefully a lower interest rate, once you move into it and once you're back in Australia. So that's the second consideration. Have a look at the rates that are available to you. Now, the third critical consideration, and one that is often overlooked, is the probation requirements. So quite a number of our clients, and if it's the case with John, if he's thinking that he's going to go back to Australia with his employer and that he'll remain largely in the same sort of role and that there won't be probation applied, then that's not really going to impact his ability to borrow that money in Australia shortly after he moves back. However, If John decides that he's actually going to quit his job, leave the company, and go back to Australia with a new employer, if his new employment contract has a probationary period, which can often be 3 to 6 months back in Australia, then he may find that he needs to wait until that probation period is over before he can actually borrow the money. So if you are looking to buy a place that you can move straight into back in Australia, you're not interested in renting or living with family, then you certainly want to give some thought to what impact that probation may have on your ability to borrow. The next critical consideration for John is to consider what lenders are actually available for both expats, i.e. while John's offshore in Singapore, and for residents, i.e. once he moves back to Australia. Of the 50 odd lenders that are available in Australia, there are often between about 10 to 15 that will lend to Australians living and working overseas. So often, John will have access to quite competitive interest rates. In most cases, as an Australian citizen, he's not going to get charged a premium just because he lives offshore. But at the same time, he's going to want to think about, as are you, if you're thinking about buying your forever home, is the lender that's available to you as an expat going to be the best lender for you once you're back on the ground, living in your property in Australia? Now again, a little bit like the fixed variable rates, investor to owner occupier rates, give some thought again to how you structure your loan. You may find that keeping it variable as an investor with a certain lender that was available to you as an expat is the most sensible option, because you're then going to refinance to a different lender once you're back in Australia with an owner-occupier rate, because the fees are lower, the interest rate's better, the features are better, whatever may be the case. Just consider how you structure it as an expat compared to what it's going to be once you move home. Now, the second last consideration for John is the time frame to returning to Australia. Now, this is an important one from a cash flow and a tax perspective. If John's thinking that he might be back in Australia in the next 2 years, or it might be 5 or 10 years, if he's not planning to rent out that property and he's going to borrow 70 or 80% of it to purchase it, the holding costs of that property may start to add up quite quickly. So you need to think through what tax deductions this is going to create, what the cash flow is going to look like. Can you continue to afford to service the loan as interest rates continue to rise? So again, just think through that time frame. That'll give you a good guide as to how you buy, how you structure the loan, whether it's fixed or variable, which lenders are most suitable, and what the whole scenario looks like. Let's get into the final consideration. I hope you found them helpful so far. Now, the final one to think about is your net income that the lender will allow you to include for serviceability. Now, there are some lenders that will accept bonuses that are paid to expats. There are some that will only accept bonuses if they're paid in cash. There are some that will accept it if it's paid in shares. There are some that will accept certain currencies, others will ignore them. Some that will apply Australian tax rates, some that will accept your net income in Singapore or wherever else you may be. It is a myriad of different considerations, different factors that do get applied. So again, why it's important to run your serviceability, to work out how much you can borrow whilst an expat, and what that might look like once you're back in Australia, because you may find that those numbers differ quite considerably. And if you are having trouble with lenders around who will include bonuses and who won't, very important to do your homework, reach out to your mortgage broker who is experienced in working with expats, and you'll find that they are often able to identify a sensible solution for you. I hope that's been helpful. I hope that's given a bit of thought to, or a few factors, I guess, to consider when it comes to the question of should I buy my forever home before I move back to Australia. If you have any questions, comments, stories you'd like to share, drop me a note in the comments. Please remember to like, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next time.